this computer. Okay, I think we're all set. So first of all, I want to thank all of us for your patience. I've been out for 6 weeks trying to wrap up a manuscript on Derrida's critique of the Western University. So Paul and others may know of the works and the history that from 1975, and I'm not sure when Gref formed, but in the late 70s, from 75 to 1990, the French volumes, The Right to Philosophy, Who's Afraid of Philosophy in English, and Eyes of the University, but the volumes were published in French in 1990, translated, released in English in 2002, 2004. But it's this history of critiques that were made intermittently, given his own displacements and mutations and expulsions from the French system, his incorporation here in the Anglo-American world, the UK and the United States, but really mostly the United States. His own long history here in the United States. I think that the postdoc at Harvard and Johns Hopkins and Yale, and then eventually UC Irvine, where I studied with him. So there's a lot of material, some of which I guess are still being translated and then published, where he's making these explicit critical evaluations, if not flat out critiques of the Western University. So I just did a manuscript on that, where I kind of leave him behind and I go back to our other guys, Hegel, Heidegger, some Marx and Weber, and even a medievalist, Jacques Le Goff, who was his colleague at the École des Études, a famous French medievalist who looked at the origins of the Western University, obviously in the Middle Ages. So those of you that are familiar with the Western tradition, um, how it had a very tenuous start back then with regard to sovereignty and the idea of the fiefdoms and the kings, and then what Derrida picks up on, which is this really uncertainty of the nature of academic labor and the dismissal of it, the reduction of all labor to sin within this Christian cosmos, and then this kind of internal battle. But of course, he plays around with so many possibilities. So that's how the story begins. It's not your traditional self-congratulatory story of the Western University. Like, born in this hyper-Christian cosmos, it's the progenitor of eventual modernism and secularism in the sciences, speaking of science and systematicity, the retrieval of Aristotle, the transmission of Aristotle. So, long story short, it's not just about Derrida's critical evaluations. It's about the whole historical problem of the Western University, which today is debated vociferously by the right wing, the left, everybody in between, about what the university is, what it's going to be, etc. So we're back, and I'm hoping we can maybe refresh a little bit before we get started. I just want to situate where we left off, and I think we're entering into our eighth session now, but we'd actually started section 6 of the second part of the introduction, or introduction chapter 2. The introduction is divided between two chapters before you get to the actual chapter 1 of being in the world, in division 1. But 6 is where he announces this strange idea of destruction, which has been profoundly misinterpreted, as has deconstruction, and then the history of their relationship. Derrida's being influenced to the extent that he could, given whatever translations were coming to him. He having his own primordial ideas about deconstruction, as we're seeing in his encounter with Husserl in the 50s, and his thesis, I think it's his licence, which was on the problem of Genesis and the phenomenology of Husserl. And then, of course, this origin of geometry. So I'm not saying deconstruction is destroying here, but they have a relationship. So we won't be able to get back to the chapter 6, where you really get a strong sense in Derrida's Husserl, the origin of geometry, about the living present, the problem of intersubjectivity. How can we come to a geometric problem and see its proof for the first time like a kid and say, well, wow, if the kid learns how to do that, this is solid, this is true, I see the deduction, this is a completed proof, and hey, wow, this is great, the human mind can discover this, and I can do it too, even though I wasn't the first geometer for that particular problem. So that whole idea of living presence, that connect, and of course he's going to deconstruct that very obvious empirical example of the solidity of both the founding of the geometric proof at some point and then the repetition of the heritage. He's going to problematize that. But here, very early on in being in time, also, I think if we come to grips with it, um, and if it's okay, if you want to indulge me, do we want to continue down this path of the slow reading to see how far we can get? So at least we can define terms, because what he's doing here is he's foreshadowing. Um, if we think about the composition of being in time, in this section 6, he's foreshadowing. He's introducing terms that he'll only really get into and define in sections 72, 74, and 75 of chapter 5 of division 2, temporality and historicality. So it's really, how can you do this to us, Heidegger? These are very weird terms. We're going to have to look at the German too. And you're going to plot them here and then not get to them until much later. So that's kind of one of the issues with this section. But let's just try to get through the first couple of paragraphs, see how far we get, and then maybe we have to get to the heart of this section 6, which is going to bring us back to temporality, even though he's talking about history here and historicality. But we have to move as far as we possibly can. Otherwise, we won't be able to finish this section 6. I think this could be potentially the third session on just this beginnings of it. So is that okay just to do a recapitulation since we haven't met for a while? Great. I hear Gordon nodding and Paul. Uh, okay. So the task of destroying the history of ontology. Basic definitions, if fundamental ontology is going to mean the science of the meaning of being, not traditional ontology, what is being, even what is time, what is anything in terms of our metaphysical tradition, what is the ousia or the verb and the function of verb is, or to be when it comes to the essence or form of something. So it's not the history of ontology per se in terms of traditional ontology. It is that history that he's going to destroy, but his outline here in Being and Time to be able to announce the possibility of fundamental ontology, if you recall, is the question of the meaning of being, not what is being, and then answering it. And the meaning of the question, which is not circular. That's how it all starts. To pose it anew. Are we thinking about the question of being today? No. Are we thinking about the fact that we're not thinking about it and that we're not perplexed by it? No. Very opening. A double kind of displacement. So, okay, we have to pose this question, but we can't just ask it again, like his contemporaries or history. We're going to pose this anew in terms of the formation of the question, and the inquirer that's going to be built into that question is this entity Dasein, which is not another ontic being whose essence we're going to ask about, like things that are present at hand or ready at hand in the world. So that's the connection between Dasein and fundamental ontology. There is no fundamental ontology. It's a Dasein analytic with these two divisions. But here he's announcing this task. It's almost like this destruction task has to relate to this task of deconstruction, which we haven't even defined yet in Derrida. I do have the Difference text for those of you that are familiar, most famously published in Margins of Philosophy. The French is 1972, English 1982. But if you look at that, even that 1972 collection of essays, like Writing Indifference in 1967, but 1972, many of those essays were published in the 60s, like the famous Difference. So I might take a look at that just so we can. At this point, I think we're kind of racing ahead. We haven't even finished the 1962 Origin of Geometry. We haven't gotten to all the works in the 60s yet, insofar as they're available and translated. But Difference is obviously, for those of you that know some Derrida, is the pivotal kind of neither word nor concept, but tool, weapon, mechanism, grapheme to critique the phoneticization of writing. So he's against all living speech or presence. And he doesn't have a simple definition of writing either, as its derivative or substitution, the copy of speech. Speech is a copy of a mental image. Writing is the copy of that. It's the inferior derivative. That's how he starts grammatology in his critique of Aristotle. But deconstruction is also not a simple word, but maybe we'll take that detour through difference to understand what's at stake. Because for both thinkers, it's going to come back to this temporalization, temporalization in difference, and temporalization in Heidegger, and temporality, which he says here. Okay, so he says all research, this is Heidegger, section 6, all research, and not least which operates within the range of the central question of being, is an ontical possibility of Dasein. So when you see that anyone who wants to pose the question of being, even metaphysicians in our tradition, maybe the pre-Socratics, but definitely Plato, Aristotle, up to Hegel, even Nietzsche, the last metaphysician, who tried to overturn everything, being becomes becoming, as later Heidegger says. But all these guys, but definitely the empirical social sciences, anyone who works on texts, which would be the humanities, certainly scientists, not that they're out to arrive at fundamental truths, but even the process of discovery and research and hypothesis making and their data and all the methods they use. For Heidegger, all this is ontical. It presupposes something. There's a pre-comprehension. It's not the Husserlian reduction of bracketing based on the ego of what my essential experience is of something as I'm attuned to the intentions in my consciousness about the thing I'm talking about. It's not the phenomenological Husserlian issue of a reduction of a thing so I can get to those essential features of the experience of my own consciousness. That's very subjective still for Heidegger, who makes his critique. He's almost talking about everything. So you can imagine this everything. And interestingly, Derrida and difference, he says, difference is, it's not, I'll have to requote it because I don't want to misquote it, but it's against everything insofar it is not anything, and it's not everything that you might think is. I think I'm screwing that up, but I'll get to the actual quote. But the point is that he too is very reluctant to even state that it's neither absence nor presence. He's always saying that it's not this or that. Can't even say what it is. You have to cross out that subjective predicate idea of it being anything. That doesn't mean it's not nothing either, so it's not a play of dialectics. But here we're not talking about Dasein itself. Everything seems to be, every creation, production, act is an ontological possibility of Dasein, but it's not Dasein's being which finds its meaning in temporality. Temporality is the condition which makes historicality, Geschichtlichkeit, not Geschichte, not Historie, history, not Geschichte, the academic historians. Geschehen, happening, Geschick, destiny, Schicksal, fate. Geschichtlichkeit, the ontological understanding of the possibility of all those. That's this historicality. So he doesn't define it here. I'm just pulling in from chapter 5. So you're going to have to say, okay, this looks very circular. Dasein, temporality is also, which makes historicality possible as a temporal kind of being, which Dasein itself possesses. That's pretty cool, regardless of whether or how Dasein is an entity in time. Innerseitigkeit, within time, clock and calendar, 2026. Horrifically, Trump was reelected in 2024. Took power 2025. That's within time. That's chronological calendar time. The datable past, decades, centuries, millennia, epochs. She's a Western structure, ancient, medieval, modern. That's all within time. And here we are in time. And all these terrible things are happening in the world. All these ridiculous people running the world and doing the terrible things that they're doing. That's the within time. That's not what he's talking about. That's not the temporal kind of being. Even though this ontological possibility of Dasein is running its course in time, and temporality is not time, period. Just don't think of time as like what time is it? And, so even more complicated, the arrangement of the aspects that we think of past, present, and future, all their possible permutations and iterations, also as either what time is, or the idea of being within that in terms of its flow. Typically, we think of a unidirectional flow. We can't go back to the past, presumably. Future is always coming. We got to go into that. This present displaces itself into a past. The past has to become something that we then recall, here. It's not that flux and complexity. That's what Heidegger is going to have to destroy in terms of the tradition. It's quite novel. So, historicality as a determinate character is prior to what is called history, world historical historizing. What is this? Weltgeschichte, there's your geschehen. While the verb geschehen orderly means to happen, will often be translated, Heidegger stresses its etymological kinship to Geschichte or history, as I just mentioned. We get a little bit of the chapter 5 here. I don't want to say that we don't, but not to the full extent. Because it turns out Geschehen and historizing is actually movement, but it's not motion of a thing or a change in place. It's the actual motility of life and existence in its throne, ecstatic openness. That's a lot of jargon, but the point is that once we get to division 2, you'll see that this Geschehen is more than just happening or an event. To bring out this connection, we have coined the verb, and these the English translators, historize, which might be paraphrased as to happen in an historical way. Not just being historic, getting elected to be president, winning the Nobel Prize, getting an Olympic gold medal, winning the World Cup. Some of you like that. We usually translate Geschehen this way in the context where history is being discussed. We trust that the reader will keep in mind that such historizing is characteristic of all historical entities. It's not the sort of thing that is done primarily by historians. That's interesting. So the historical representation of the past or scholarship about the causes of something or the description of something so we can enlighten ourselves in the present, like, hey, here are the ordinance of the French Revolution. That should tell us about the collapse of democracies because of the right wing today, because of the counter. Historians can do that. They're wonderful people. But that's not what we're talking about. Historizing, as you'll see, has really nothing to do with the past or happening like an event today that's going to become historical. Let's come back to here. So that's all a lot of bracketing so this first paragraph here really doesn't tell us much, even with the footnote. It tries here to say more. Historicality stands for the state of being that is constitutive for Dasein's historizing as such. Only on the historizing happening in a historical way, the peculiar movement internal to this Dasein, that's not the movement of a thing in time, definitely not Aristotle's problems of the metaphysics of motion. Being moved, is it a part of the thing that's being moved? Can we actually perceive motion itself independent of it? That's a lot of metaphysically complex problems that descend from ancient Greece. Happening of the movement as historical, again, without being anything ontic or empirical, like whatever people tell us is an historic event, the historic discovery of some archaeological finding that changes the way we think about our past and what human beings are, etc. Historic, we're going to land on another planet, I don't know, or the most historic that everyone's obsessed with these days, the alien extraterrestrial encounter. That's not what's being discussed here. Stands Tuesday for Dasein's historizing, and to be honest, it's the ontological understanding of that, which again is never something present to hand. So you're going to say, what the heck is he talking about? History happening today is not present to hand. All those representations we teach kids in history books about the past, the American Revolution, it's not that. So what is he talking about? Why use these words? All those, the history that we teach and learn and talk about, that is made possible by something more primordial. Anything like world history is possible, or can anything belong historically to world history? In its factical being, thrownness, projection of possibilities, what it anticipates, but can't ever complete, because that'll be death. Death is not biological death or perishing. It's a possibility, the greatest possibility to be singular and radically individuated, meaning it's not just inside me right now as an aging person that's going to die eventually biologically, but as a possibility to be. I'm going to bracket all that, but it's factual being and the thrownness towards that, being towards death, which we should be concerned about, which is going to be rooted again in temporality, as you'll see. He's saying something out here. Any Dasein is as it already was. It's not just as a 55-year-old, I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way up to 55 already in my 55. It's not a analytic problem of numbers and or the Parmenides. How am I this 155 these many different years in it? All my memories from childhood up to now or whatever I've experienced. So that's not what he means. That's all onto. It could be the flux or the agglutination. Is it the Bergsonian accumulation that comes with me as I transpire and I move, or the relationship between my protensions, retentions, and protensions, what is past, what is future, coming together in a whole, it's moving. There's some kind of strange relationship between the three ecstasies, past, present, and future. Is it that? Not quite. Because the isness and the predicate of being its past makes, you might think it's making the present past. The past is always, is already is. It is what is, it already was. It is its past, whether explicitly or not. You may want to think about that in many different ways. Obviously, psychoanalysis can take us into very complicated conversations about repression and trauma, and how we related to our own past and the prematurity of birth, as Lacan said in Mirror Stage. You know, we haven't even come to grips with our birth. He means the physical birth, the fetal structure, and then when you come out 0 to 2, the mirror stage, in terms of our relationship to our own bodies and subjectivities. It is its past. Okay, well, what can that? You're always tempted to take all those accumulated experiences and just shove that into your being right now. And he's not talking about that. This is so not only in that its past is, as it were, pushing itself along behind it, that Dasein possesses what is past as a property, which is still present at hand, and which sometimes has after effects upon it. Dasein is its own past in the way of its own being, which, to put it roughly, historizes out of its future on each occasion. See, here we're already foreshadowing ecstatic temporality, which we'll get into. This is so not only, he's saying, it is its past, explicitly or not. One possibility could be what most people think of. This is so not only in that its past is kind of always there pushing you into the future, but kind of coming along with you. You take it with you, whether you want to remember it or not. Nietzsche says we've lost the art of forgetfulness. We're enslaved by the machine of everything. We're forced to remember. Because if we don't, we can't make promises, we can't keep contracts, and the system will just beat us down. And that's why we have memory. If we didn't have memory, we wouldn't have conscience. The genealogy, when he makes this great original critique of this idea of we're being forced to have memory. We've lost the art of forgetting. Well, that's this past kind of always coming along, pushing itself along behind us. I wish I can just detach it. Almost I wish I can sometimes erase all my memories before this, especially if a lot of them are not good. But that's one possibility, and that means you possess it as a property, but that makes things present at hand. And Dasein isn't present at hand. Everything else is. So it's not present. We want to get to the question of what it means to be present, or presencing. Dasein is its past. Rather, Dasein is its past as the ontological register now, in contrast with in the way of its own being. It historizes out of the future. If you want to see that as not anticipation of the future event, in a half an hour and 2 hours I have another meeting, or tomorrow is, today's Wednesday, tomorrow's Thursday, in my time. That's not the future. You might want to say it's me coming towards my having been, that only when out in the future, am I going to really have an understanding of what this present that I'm living now. In the future me, I'm going to remember this present and have it as a nice memory of some past. From the standpoint of future, some past. It's not that either, because you're already connecting past, present, and future. Is it the genuine sense of what I can mean in terms of my whole stretch of life? When I look back at everything, well, that gets us maybe closer to, how do I come to grips with the possibility of no longer being in the world, which would be death? Then have some authentic vision, moment of vision of what I will have meant, in terms of the accumulation of what I want to be for this whole stretch. Maybe that's it. It's that really weird feeling, could be anxiety of just my mortality. I'm born as a bucket of water. I poke a hole in it from birth. Plato and Heidegger says too, from the moment you're born, you're going to be ready to die. You're just losing time, and you know it. Those of us that are older, we know it, we feel it. So, but is it that? Well, no. That doesn't get to the authentic sense. But the will have been may be a feature of this when you say I will have been, without answering what that question is. Because then you're going to make a present. Or you're just going to grab a future possibility. In 3 hours, I got to meet this person. So that's not it. And if the past comes out of it, it really can't be the accumulation of things that you've already experienced. When I was 10 years old, I rode a bike and I did this. Okay, whatever the way of being it may have at the time, Zeitikung, timeliness, timing, timeliness, and thus with whatever understanding of being it may possess, Dasein has grown up both into and in a traditional way of interpreting itself. In terms of this, it understands itself proximately and within a certain range constantly. By this understanding, the possibilities of its being are disclosed and regulating. Its own past, this always means the past of its generation, is not something which follows along after Dasein, but something which already goes ahead of it. Its generation, who is being contemporaneous with others, which is a big thing for his future definition of historicality. The whole problematic of destiny and fate and seizing the time, which brings up a lot of scholarship on the Nazi question, what is the between that destiny and the people, the generation, but in the later chapter, and of course what we know happens in Heidegger's life and history into the Nazi period, bracket that question, but generation, being ready for its fate, to see something, receive the tradition, but don't just take for granted what we're saying in the present, scholarship of that past tradition, do something new, be historic, happen in a historical way, have that will to power to choose what's being handed down, but rework it for the purpose of something new, not just learn, in terms of rote memory, what the past can teach us. But this elemental historicality Dasein may remain hidden from Dasein itself. I want to stop here because there's already a lot happening here. You get some foreshadowing of this ecstatic temporality. How do you historize happening in a historical way out of the future, but not the chronological time that we're flowing into? Trump and all these bozos are trying to architect a world that nobody wants, and in fact is horrifying. That's this historical trajectory happening, which a lot of us want to resist, but we feel helpless. So it's got to be something else. And then the past isn't just me going into my future and enjoying that this present, which I'll remember, is a nice past that I want to keep as a treasure or group. So this event of destruction, given how complex this temporal problem is not something necessarily negative, because you can't destroy this process because it doesn't exist right now. And it's not the future that agents and intentional human beings are architecting to create something. And if you use a simple definition of the past, if it's no longer, you really can't destroy it. You can forget something, but you can't really travel in time and go destroy that thing. So it never happened. We'll leave that up to the physicists, the twin, to go back in time, kill your grandfather so you couldn't be born. So how could you have started that? Let them have fun with that stuff. That's all linear spatialized time. He's not talking about that. So if it's okay, The reason I want to pivot, we haven't even gotten to this definition of destruction and how would it possibly relate to all this. But if we go to the basic definition of difference then, before we come to the ordinary geometry where there's margins, let's see if this shows it. Can you see this text? Is this text clear on the screen? This is the
It's a
chapter
little bit
differ.
smaller.
You can see it, Eric? Okay, good.
Yep.
Difference. This is. I'll just quickly
I
show.
just wanted, um, I
Yes.
apologize for interrupting. I wonder if we could, before moving on to this text, if I could just make a quick observation about the text that we just left behind
Oh,
in
please. Yeah, please, Eric.
in a certain Derridean
I'll bring it
uh,
back.
res,
I'll bring it
re,
back. Yeah.
a certain
Mhm.
Derridean resonance that may go unnoticed in the translation. So the sentence that is sort of defining historicality. Yeah, historicality stands for the state of being that is constitutive for, etc. I'm going to put the German version in the chat and just point out that it ends with that what is translated in the English version here as belong to world history is in the German gehören,
Yeah.
which
Right.
then sort of like um, anticipates, so to speak, the whole like ear theme that Derrida develops in a number of texts later on, in the mostly in the 80s. But this
Right.
whole theme of like hearing being and the theme of like the call is sort of is implicitly there. I mean, of course, belong to is a perfectly normal English translation of that term, but it does etymologically have the root, which is a listening to. So it's, so in a sort of etymological sense, what he's saying is like that, on the basis of this, did something respond to the call of world history or something like that, answer to the name of world history, something like that. And also want to point out, which is, of course, been implicit in what you've said and in the translator's notes, but you know, in a certain sense, you could say this whole um, distinction between what they're calling historicality and historizing and so forth seems very confusing in the English and probably also in the French, but is a perfectly like necessary thing to do when the German term Geschichte is used most of the time for what is history. Like Dilthey will use both forms, um, but like in French it's just histoire, and in English everything is history. Whereas in German you have Historizität and you have Geschicklichkeit, so you kind of like you either have to treat them as synonyms or you have to give them a technically just differentiated meaning, which is the path that Heidegger goes. Anyway,
Eric,
that just
Eric,
a
you
brief.
gave us a lot. You gave us a lot there, which is great. The Gehirn, by the way, which you bracketed, you're referring to the Geschlecht series, maybe in a lot of other things in the 80s, which is interesting because hearing and phonetic writing and presence is what he starts out his critique with in overturning the speech writing distinction. But the hearing, as you said, the attunement, the Befindlichkeit, maybe in Heidegger. But what is he hearing with regard to the transmission, but also um, the whole critiques that are made in the 80s about nationalism and race and sex and the whole Nazi question? Is he hearing something that resonates with the time for action, for something revolutionary? But of course, he's making a critique. But the hearing what you're saying here in this context, and there's many things you said, is this attunement, Befindlichkeit, but also when he gets to the call and the conscience, is that you're not hearing something like from God, like the Lutheran call, hey, this is my profession. I'm going to give up everything and do this. I'm the calling to vocation for Catholic priesthood. So it's not something you hear, but it's something you choose to choose, as he says. You choose to have this position of silence, actually, that you work with to be able to receive authentically the most authentic possibility to be. So you can get away from the they and the fallenness and the inauthenticity and really come back to yourself, your greatest possibility from all the possibilities out there. You choose to have the conscience, which is not morality and guilt. You learn that from Nietzsche. So the hearing, you're right, and all the registers for the German, yeah, I mean, you mentioned history, well, but in the English we have history. There's two things. History, the story that's told and representation. History that's written and studied. History, which is the chronological calendar time. And then historicity as, I guess, an adverb, not an adjective, but the quality of being historical, or finite. When there's two, you can't really say much more than that. But Historicität, as the German translation of our historicity, Geschichte, Schicksal, and Geschicht, the relation, fate, destiny, Geschichte in the two senses. History with the IE is history, but Geschichte, and then this Geschichtlichkeit is the ontological historicality, understanding of all those registers. And then historizing, which is the Geschehen, which may or may not be historical, could just be event or happening, as is Ereignis. But you're absolutely right. If you don't have those registers, not because you just want to sell German. By the way, when we get to Derrida, on his difference on the Latin versus the Greek, yeah, if you don't have those registers, then you're going to be inclined and tempted to assign all your intuitions about what all of our basic understandings of history and the historical are with regard to temporality. As he famously says in chapter 5, it's not that because we're in history that we're temporal. This whole thing, he says it here too, is rooted in a more primordial temporality that allows us for the there of history, whether it's the past or whatever's happening now, for it to even actually occur to us in a meaningful way. So he starts from that more primordial ground as to what makes even these ordinary senses of history possible. If he wants to deconstruct ordinary linear time, this irreversible spatialized time of nows in encountering Aristotle with this primordial temporality, he's doing also that with our ordinary understanding of historical time. So, but let's look at the difference real quick, and then I think that might be a good way to transition to our discussion with maybe one paragraph back to origin of geometry. But this may be good just to have before we even go any further in our group, so we can all sort of have at least some kind of working terms. And you know, it's novel. He's doing this in the 60s now. And then, you know, there's a fair amount of time spent on just difference, of course, trace and supplement, and dissemination of Pharmacon and Plato. Many of the registers that will occur, the archive in the late 70s, O'Keeffe. But this difference, which doesn't really show up later, as in like beyond the 80s and 90s, of course, it's always there. It moves on in many different directions. But if this is like the Archimedean lever or pivot, because you really don't want to say what it is, kind of like you don't want to say what deconstruction is or destruction is, because people will just misunderstand. Oh, it's his method. Oh, it's a philosophy. Oh, it's a Derrida's writing. Oh, it's just a nice term that you literally think you're taking something apart to put it back together or look at its inner workings. It's not any of that, but it does depend upon this difference. If you're going to believe this, difference with the A, as you can see, not difference with the E. See, when I say it, you can't see the writing of the A or the E. That's his point, which maybe strategically puts writing in a new space, detached from phoneticized versions of not only writing, but the priority of living speech and presence. Neither word nor concept. If you know your Saussure, who was a great guy because he already showed the arbitrary nature of sign formation, signifier, uh, word, concept, spoken word, written word, signified corresponding object, mental image, maybe concept, logos, meaning the essence of that word, but the correspondence of the cat, when I say cat in English, the furry cat, corresponding to an object. Well, the sign is the unity of that. And Saussure is like, well, if you go across languages, obviously, not only is the relationship between any signifier and signified arbitrary, so is the formation of their unity. And then there's a differentiation in the language so that more of these signs can form based on this correspondence. So that's great. We already know that. That's a great breakthrough for our understanding of language and linguistics. So nothing essential about any language and its ability to represent anything. It has nothing to do with truth propositions or value of propositions. It's just that's how language functions. But here he's saying it's not even a word or concept. If not to master the thought here, being that which is maintaining a certain necessary relationship with the structural limits of mastery, what is most irreducible about our era. This is so fascinating. So Heidegger is talking about historicality. Why is he talking about our time now? He says that again in the beginning of grammatology. Therefore, I'm starting strategically from the place and the time in which we are, even though in the last analysis my opening is not justifiable, since it's only on the basis of difference and its history that we can allegedly know who, where we are, and what the limits of an era might be. Look at that. Historicality makes possible world historizing, being in history, knowing that this is an historic thing happening. And there are plenty of historic things happening, especially for those of us that live in the United States, all of which are bad. But something is making that possible for me to be thrown into that relationship, to be able to even receive that. We care about philosophically the more primordial possibility that allows for that to happen. Look at this. To talk about we, it's like his own circularity here, or era, or this time, or our time. Difference, its history makes those registers possible. Even though difference is neither a word nor concept, nevertheless attempt a simple and approximate semantic analysis that will take us into within sight of what's at stake here for everything, which is the pivotal moment for what will become this whole thing called deconstruction associated with Derrida. Here's the Latin. Deferere, Latin verb, deferere, has two meanings which seem quite distinct. 7 English, two distinct meanings of Latin. Deferere become two separate words. Yeah, so that's the famous bifurcation. Defer, as in postpone, although there are many registers to DEFER, and differ. I beg to differ. We're different. I'm creating a difference, instantiating a difference, differentiating this amount from that amount. Marx's equivalence between the exchange value of commodities, the great Marxian moment. That difference between two things and the exchangeable value is all nonsense. The creation, which you need for capitalism. So any kind of differentiation you can't take for granted here too. And then the defer, postpone, put off to later. Let's see what he says about that. I don't want to speak for Derrida. But here this is important. The object of two separate articles in this sense, the Latin differ, is not simply a translation of the Greek diaphere, if I pronounce it properly, dia through, you know that, and dia is also a part, hence the idea of difference, and ferrein is to, you can just Google this, that's how I found out most of this, although I don't know a little bit of Greek, but the ferrein, reminded, is to carry or to bear, carry through or apart, which doesn't make sense, bear apart, take apart. I guess what will eventually could become like to differ with the I, to make a difference, create a difference, diaphere, carry through apart, make apart, break apart. And this will not be without consequences for us linking our discourse to a particular language. I guess for him it's French, and to a language that passes as less philosophical, less originally philosophical than the other. Is that Greek or Latin and French? Latin for French versus what Hegel and Heidegger would both say. To do metaphysics, you can only do it in Greek or German, which you educated us on, Eric. For the distribution of the meaning, in the Greek diapherein does not comport one of the two motifs of the Latin differe, to wit, the action of putting off until later, of taking account of time and the forces of an operation that implies an economical calculation, a detour, a delay, a relay, a reserve, a representation. Concepts that I would have summarized here in a word I've never used, but that could be inscribed in this chain. Temporization, which of course has its French version, which is not temporalization or temporalizing of time as such and such, the before and after, or within the horizon of before and after, which is what Heidegger picks up on, and Aristotle. And delay, don't just think is the train is delayed, or I got an assignment for my class I got to do. I haven't written it yet. I feel bad. I'm putting it off and postponing because I don't want to do it. I'm anxious about that. Because in fact, if it's strategic, it allows for a reckoning. It allows for you to have that authentic relationship to the question of time. Because if you are creating a gap between what should happen now, you're not doing it, it's not arriving, you're putting it off. That space in between allows you to really ponder what's happening with regard to not only you in regards to what time is, but your this kind of self-relational idea of time. That they're in that very gap or distanciation. There's this profound anxiety. I guess if you completed the task and you met the deadline, you feel good about it, you don't need to worry about it. So what's in fact here is taking what could be a negative experience, like the terrible thing of postponing something. I really got to clean my house, or my partner will, tell me that I need to clean my house, and I don't want to experience that. Um, it allows me to really actually inhabit that space to be in the question of what time even is. That can take us back to Heidegger. But then more than that, it's this calculation of the detour delay that becomes necessary because no signifier is ever going to land on a signified. Every signified, as much as we want to believe in it, the presence of a concept or an idea that refers to the word, that too is a play that conceals what's being postponed or arriving with regard to what the thing is. So every signified, as he says, is just another signifier. But this can't go on forever because every word can have this intuition of what it is. Dialectically is opposite. It's not an infinite play, which would be opposed to a finite, or an open system versus a closed. Those are all binaries. And inside the binary is the difference, which doesn't reveal itself, hence the delay. You can start to see some of the interconnections here. In other words, just like with Heidegger's historicality, I wouldn't, we don't want to reduce these to kind of like our normal intuitions of what we mean by delay. Typically, delayed means something negative for most people. Oh shit, the train's delayed. It's not here on board. I'm going to miss my meeting. I got to go. It's not that. There's a delay, delayed, reserved representation. Is that happening in every act of writing, every reading of a writing, every interpretation, or any origin, even the origin of a geometrical truth and proof? Is that concealing this delay? Deforay is, in this sense, is to temporize, to take recourse consciously or unconsciously, going to his Freud, in the temporal and temporizing mediation of a detour that suspends the accomplishment or fulfillment of desire or will. It equally affects the suspension in mode that annuls or tempers its own effect. So it does both. So it suspends, completing, finishing, teleological ending. Because you put the end in, you make it present, it's complete, then you're stuck. So it's not the end of history, Fukuyama. You're suspending that, putting it off. Is more about suspension of an end, let's say from origin to end. Fulfillment of desire or will, that can get us into some psychoanalysis. But the suspension also tempers the effect of this postponing. This sounds pretty fancy. Temporization is temporization and spacing, becoming time as space, the gap or delay between the two things. The thing that's supposed to happen, that's not happening. What's going to arrive and make it happen? Is that? And then time, which you don't want to say what that is, calls it the originary constitution of time and space. Becoming space and time, you don't want to turn time into a being or make it present. You want to let it be, in its sort of mystery. But all these are required as metaphysics or transcendental phenomenology would say to use the language here that's criticized and displaced. He doesn't like using this language. He's trying to criticize and displace it, kind of like the destruction. But suspension of something that's supposed to happen. don't want to temporalize that as like an event and make it present. In that allows for the kind of conscious, unconscious reckoning of what's happening. That allows us to be a little bit more authentic, kind of slow things down a bit. Say, hey, what am I really doing? Which is what a philosopher wants to ask anyway. Okay, so you think, okay, well, that's one idea. I like this idea of suspending as opposed to purposely saying, I'm putting something off or delaying. The other sense, what most people think, which is according to Derrida on the Greek, that's the only sense you get from the Greek, which may or may not be true because many of the ways to work with the Greek are different. As we would probably find in the German. Other sense of different is the more common identifiable one, to be not identical, to be other than what one is. I take this discernible as to be not identical, to be not discernible, not to be other, and then to also be discernible, because it's not about understanding. And then the simplistic version of Hegel, spirit knows itself when it knows itself in its otherness and overcomes the difference, which is a type of suspension too and raising the Aufheben, but knowing oneself and their difference or the identity of identity and non-identity. So it's not that, but it's just not this is not that. But then you can't locate the event of that difference and make it present, the concept of that difference, just by contrasting the two things that you're saying are different. Me and Robbie, we're different people. He's in Australia, I'm here. But what exactly is the difference in terms of the relationship of difference? When dealing with difference, difference, yes, a word that can be written with the final ts or ds, as you will, whether it is a question of dissimilar otherness. So if it's difference with the t versus differens, which Leotard picks up on, I can see where that's going in the next paragraph. That's what it's pointing to. A word that can be written with the final ts or the final ds, you will, whether it's a question of dissimilar otherness, allergic, I like that, polemical otherness, an interval, a distance spacing must be produced between the elements, split the wood apart. Now there's this gap in between. Difference, the creation of the difference. Can't put them back together. The spacing must be produced between the elements and be produced within a certain perseverance and repetition. Interesting. Repeating what? The spacing that allows the difference to maintain itself. Is that what's preserved? Otherwise, they're clasped back into one. There's no difference. Now the word difference with an E can never refer either to differe as temporalization or to difference with the DS as polemos, polemic, debate, war. Thus, the word difference with an A is to compensate economically this loss of meaning, for difference can refer simultaneously to the entire configurations of its meanings. It is immediately and irreducibly polysemic. So the A difference compensates for perhaps this duality. It compensates for the weaker differe, which just means difference, to differ, as opposed to postpone, delay, suspend. The A allows you, so difference with the E can never have both meanings. The difference with the A allows to compensate for that loss because it can have all these possibilities. So what are we trying to do here? Let's try to bring this to a close so we can have a conversation. Let me just come back to Heidegger. I guess the takeaways in both these moments, simply put in the simplest manner possible, Cartesian dualism. Here's me, the subject. There's presumably some external world. Or if you don't want that extendedness or distinction or difference, let's say you don't like that, just take this subject, if you want to assume it's unified as some kind of substance, and the fact that it's thinking allows for you to say at least the thinking exists and the thought and the being are partaking of one another. You don't need some simple dualism, me versus the external world. Just take this thinking subject is itself a type of irreducible substance, and the thinking is being. Both Heidegger and Derrida are going to challenge that, obviously. Derrida coming in through this linguistic kind of cleverness that he's doing, but something more profound because it gets us to this problem of time, not being in time, being as time, therefore being in an era or being in history, which then points to freedom, or as he's always saying, the deconstruction of the signature, this unconditional resistance against everything sovereign, including the university, which is being hijacked by everybody that's sovereign. It's a heterogeneous. Universe by nature should be heterogeneous to power. Shouldn't have any power. Should only have the power to question everything that's in power. But we don't have that. I don't know about you folks in other parts of the world, but it's hard to speak out these days in our universities against certain things without consequence. But the point is that we have to move along much further to see how both Derrida and Heidegger are coming at this question of temporality and what it means to be in history or be in an epoch, destroy and deconstruct those registers, not for the fun of it, but because of a certain type of necessity, attunement, hearing, and repetition of what's being passed down for an ultimate task and responsibility, which we've talked about before. And I think that's what we want to maybe kind of frame our conversation. What do we think we mean? Both thinkers, what do they feel, not subjectively, but how do they define their projects in terms of this question of being responsible, responding to, but also being responsible for, um, I guess, the task of thinking, for sure, but this question of history, being responsible for, are we trying to resist history? Are we destroying, deconstructing history? What do we, yeah, let me pause here. I want to know what folks think about perhaps the relationship between the two texts or this insofar as they relate to history. Paul, little etymological note. Oh yeah, you know the Greek. Easterlon. Easterlon. Greek word is in which the English are. Do you want to read your text, Paul? I don't want to speak for you because it seems really profound. It's up to you. And I'll come to Robbie.
I was just doing a little bit of etymological research, as I tend to do.
I think it's fantastic.
Looking at the various
Can you elaborate?
meanings of historio, which is, of course, the word that Herodotus used for the first book of history, which is often translated as investigations. But looking it up in the Liddell Scott Dictionary, you can see that its origin, and we can talk about origins, is more a legal sense, as many Greek words, ancient Greek words, do have a legal sense. So it has this sense of questioning in court, of a judge questioning a witness. But because Greek likes to invert this thing, it also has the idea of the witness giving evidence as part of the questioning process. So it works both ways. It can mean both give an account of something in court and derive an account from the proceedings of the court as the judge. And there are various other meanings as well that it comes to have. And they're very similar to the various variations of Fragen that Heidegger outlines in that very first section of being in Fragen, all of those. it relates to this idea of questioning of being and history of being, but being sort of two sides of the same thing. And then if you look at Diapero
Yeah, the
in
Diaparo
the
give us a different nuanced view than his Diapharon.
also has legal sense. It has a very, very broad range of meanings in ancient Greek, but it
Mhm.
does also have this idea of something being at dispute in court. It has this idea of something coming between two parties in a legal dispute, the apple of discord. And also, bizarrely, it can mean go through time or belong to the property, which is interesting. Although I think those are rare meanings in specific contexts. But again, the main meaning is legalistic and has this idea of a dispute in court. This metaphor of court proceedings runs through the history of philosophy, all the
Mhm.
way from Plato down through to Kant, and here we see it in
And by
Heidegger
the
and
way,
Derrida as well.
Derrida's last lectures on the death penalty and also the sovereign of the beast. But
Yeah.
here, this go through time between the property of. Remember, Heidegger speaks of the property of the past flowing to the quality of design, but going through time, not flowing through time. And then the Diaphero is the in Derrida's difference of polemical otherness or allergic and polemical otherness. But polemos is not just dispute. I guess for both, it's if you're going to talk about destruction and deconstruction, and you don't want to start with the present subject, and you don't want dialectics. A is not B, A carries a negation of B in it. You have to overcome that difference, negate that negation, raise it to a higher conception. This process and movement of synthesis, some kind of classic dialectics. But you don't want to make the event of differentiation present. That's the whole point. So there's a spacing and a delay, and yet you have it. And yet we need to work through those differences because our whole world is fraught with it. So these guys are not, I don't see them as like trying to destroy differences per se, but to admit that they exist. And then it's this question of both, in ironic ways, talk about a type of preservation in the repetition that's handed down to us, but also this differentiation from it so we can, have some, get the distance we need to like really think about what is in error, really in untruth, maybe some kind of Socratic repetition. But the whole feeling of it is that to be able to think for oneself authentically, maybe reestablish our own values too, if it's Nietzschean. But yes. Okay, well, you gave us a lot to work with, Paul. We'll come back to it. Robbie.
Yes, thank you, Rajesh. I really appreciate this discussion because, uh, especially just being able to focus on Heidegger in depth with this absolutely key destruction of the history of ontology. Uh, one of the broader themes there is that classical ontology contrasted the eternal and the temporal, and found truth in the eternal and not in the changing situation of the temporal. So through Plato and Augustine, and even in a sense through to Descartes, the idea that science gives us knowledge of natural law that is unchanging and hence eternal. And Heidegger's really challenging that. And so this destruction constitutes a uh, a deconstruction of that uh, prioritizing of the eternal over the temporal. Because when he says Dasein is its past, uh, there's a uh, a capturing of truth in everything that's happened, regardless of whether we can know and understand it, because there are unknown things in our past that, as he says, push itself along behind us, uh, and they continue to exercise causal power, often without our knowing that they do. But I just wanted to focus on the sentence in the middle of the paragraph marked paragraph 20, where he says, Dasein is its past in the way of its own being. And just at first reading, the word "its" there, that in the way of its own being, is ambiguous because does "its" refer to Dasein or to the past of Dasein?
Mhm.
Um,
When you, in the sentence, it is its past.
so where he says Dasein bracket is its past
Oh,
in
right.
the way of its own being.
Yeah, the
Like
being of the
I can,
past or the being of the doesn't.
yeah, that's right. And like both of them are actually quite meaningful. So it's uh, because there's this sort of identification with our past as constituting our our identity, um, and including in a way that we don't fully understand. Uh, so, uh, so the past continues to exist in the present is one of these themes, and I found it really interesting how he uh, continues to explore this concept in the letter on humanism, where he explores Heraclitus and ethos anthropoi daimon, that traditionally translated as character is fate. So our our character is formed by everything that has impinged upon us, and
Mhm.
that is the fate that that determines. Well, it creates the conditions of freedom, and uh, that's where this theme of, as you mentioned briefly, the existentiality is implied uh, in in this statement. Now, where is it? That historizes out of its future. Again, like that's really quite a mysterious. Uh, uh, so our being historizes out of its future. So that means that we are always, and well, in authentic being, we are anticipating our future and uh, creating it in terms of our past. So uh, I think it's a way of grounding philosophy phenomenologically in history in a
Mhm.
way that was quite foreign to the history of ontology.
Well, so Robbie, you've given us a lot here already with these fine distinctions, and I don't want to race ahead to chapter 5, but well, 65 on ecstatic temporality, which is where we get the big punchline in Division 2, Chapter 3. He's finally getting, he's got this linear time that he's already destroyed, but now what is this? Coming towards the having been. Yes, past history of the future, but the future is always in the process of having been. Gleichsprunglichkeit for Eric Sapp, the interrelation between each ecstasy, the making present, for example, is going to relate to having beenness and futurizing, or future arrival coming, coming towards coming as the future, which is not the past, present, future, but that's one interrelation. And then you can do that with the having beenness, with the futurizing, and then the making present. And then the coming, you can, that too will have some alignment. And these are all different. He calls them schemas, which is a plan of Kant. But then he gets to chapter 5 on these. You're right, because when he gets to fate and destiny, right after he talks about the Augenblick, being free for its death, shattering itself against it, only if it historizes out of the future can you come to a reckoning of your time, its time, be in the moment of vision. So we get that big piece there. But let's get back to this architectonic here. Let's not forget that the whole book, the whole architecture is time as the horizon. And we already saw that horismos is not simply a horizon like to the sky or something, but of placing limits, but also challenging them. It's the horizon for understanding the question of being. You got to reformulate that question, not in terms of answering it, but what the meaning of the question is. What's at stake here? That's going to get the inquirer into this, because the understanding of that question is built into it. Because it cares about not just listening to everybody else to answer what it means for itself, but to be able to pose that anew, because it's most concerned about its own. If the one thing it has is an understanding of this problem, and it cares about it. Oh, that seems like Dasein. Don't just assume human beings, animals, we'll get to, those, that it can take the forms of those. And it could then mean something existential for human beings in the modern age, in a secular age, or a religious age. So it's not, it's just Dasein. And that's what we have here. And the being a Dasein is going to turn out is rooted in temporality. And he says that this is not circular. Dasein trying to answer the question of the meaning of being because it's built into it's being rooted in temporality. Well, you're going to understand being, whatever that is. You got to go back to this question of time, but we don't get to that, at least in this book. And for the Heidegger scholars, you're going to say, oh, yeah, it's resolved in the comic books. I don't think so. It's just missing. He never did it, and he himself admits it. So leave him alone. If we want to do a Derridean play on this, which is what one might want to do, is, you don't. The problem with reduction phenomenologically, or to use that Derridean word, suspension of every possible intuition we could have with regard to time in general, our time, and then the macro position of all that beyond one subject or self, let's say in a collective with others, which is what Heidegger says. That's all historizing, co-historizing is, being with others in history. This is not Robinson Crusoe writing his own history of himself by himself on an island. This this phenomenological bracketing and suspension of what we mean by time and history and their relationship here is, to me, the untapped problem in both thinkers. Because otherwise we will snap back into our ordinary registers of what time is, what history is, what is their relationship, what do we really want to say? Because the origin of geometry really is, I don't know, are you with this? Because do you really, let me put this out there, do you really want to take it on face value that this guy Derrida, is Algerian, born during colonization, lived through decolonization, and then comes to France, Sephardic, Jewish, which is already a minoritized category, being Jewish, vis-a-vis the more dominant group, Ashkenazi, but a North African guy in an Arabic Muslim majority country facing colonization and decolonization as a minority within that, being Sephardic Jewish, but then also having that be erased during the time he lived in, but his own personal trajectory, then to come to Europe. And he really is putting a stake in the ground. Fanon is also a contemporary of his, as far as I know, also worked in Algeria. They didn't cross paths. Fanon died very early. But the exurg in grammatology is that he calls this whole, doesn't name it here, he does it elsewhere, but in Gramda, the logocentricism and the phonocentricism, and these hierarchies and these binary oppositions in this Western tradition is Eurocentric. And he names it as racist in the section on Levi-Strauss. That trying to make, when you write about the other, and you try to make that writing speak as if you're the speaking subject, and you don't even see the differentiation that's taking place. He says that deeper into grammatology. I just saw that. I came to it again. And I was shocked. He just literally says, this is the greatest colonial imperial, this is design of colonization and imperialism. Heidegger says ancient Greek philosophy led to modern technological nihilism. He had to say that. Derrida is saying this, the colonization and imperialization that is the West, is this is the culmination that began with this dichotomy about speech and writing, with a living present subject trying to write about itself or others, and coercing or forcing or co-opting everything else into that space of the living present. And then here you have both thinkers in different ways. The whole project, disruption, deconstruction, ontological difference, being and beings, difference, differing and differing, is an attack on this idea of being present. So long story short, Robbie, he's not Heidegger here, as we'll leave Derrida said, but here, if you just use the example of reincarnation, you're the karmic accumulation of past selves in this current living self. Now, you may know those past selves, like some kids wake up and start talking about a past life, or you may not. But if you believe in that doctrine of reincarnation, not resurrection, then you're an accumulation of your past selves in this current self, this karmic motion. But if we're not talking about that, because you're trying to make the past a living present, that you recollect or forced to recollect, as Nietzsche says, then the problem is time. It always has been time. That the West has to install three. I don't know about indigenous folks or maybe other traditions, but in the West, you have the priority of these three, past, present, future. And you, for Heidegger and Derrida in different ways, the last guy that tried to let go for it all and come up with the concept of what their very complex relationship is as together, past, present, future, an eternal logocentric concept that incorporates history is Hegel, which is how this book, Being in Time, ends. The Derrida-Hegel question comes up there. So my point is that there's a problem with the Western metaphysical tradition with regard to the imperial nature of its attempt to conceptualize time. Some of you descend from the European context, so I don't mean to offend you, but like, how would you take a statement like that? Not to personalize, but my point is like, if one descends from the European West, how do you come to grips with this powerful critique, Derrida, Robbie?
Well, I'm really focusing in on this second statement on the Heidegger page that we're looking at, where Dasein finds its meaning in temporality, and there's the distinction between temporality and the eternal. So the temporal is the realm of change, and the eternal is the realm of the unchanging.
Actually, you got to be careful there, Robbie, because that's
Sure,
not what he means by. He doesn't mean that at all. He actually says temporizing that distinction, whether it's eternal and unchangeable, because what's also eternal is the coming to be and the passing away of an irreversible, linear, inauthentic, ordinary time. That what seems to be eternal or infinite. And he's going to derive that from something more finite, ecstatic, unified, and primordial, which is this interrelation of the ecstasies, each of which is schematically organized differently as horizons. So it's not really the classic unchangeable. He gets Nietzsche by saying, you just took being and made becoming the new thing, the being of becoming, and that's your new metaphysical conception. You're not destroying metaphysics, you're the last. So he doesn't want any of these binary oppositions, neither does Derrida for sure. So the eternal time distinction, time is a moving image of eternity, section 81, Heidegger destroys that too. So you want to be careful there. Temporality is not either the infinite, irreversible flow of time. It's not just the coming to be and the passing away of nows. You can't stop it. Even after you die, it's going to go on. So it's not the unchangeable versus the changeable. The problem is the meaning of temporality is supposed to be the ground by which you can answer the question of the meaning of being. Hence this being and time in their relation. He also asks, like Aristotle, does time have any being? He doesn't answer that. He's smart, because then you're going to turn it into another being. And then you're back to square one in terms of destroying metaphysics. So I wouldn't go down with the unchangeable versus the changeable. And definitely by the time you get to historicality as movement, you're not talking about historical movement of time, like historical time, calendar time, one presidential election after another, one war after another, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know how you deal with that.
Yeah, well, I was thinking there's a statement somewhere in Being in Time that time has been used as the criterion to distinguish distinct realms, and so that time has been used to separate the eternal from the temporal. I suppose is how I understand that, and
Well,
that's
yeah, that the distinction doesn't even hold here. The classic history of the metaphysical distinction of time and eternity. He takes that on in 81 with Augustine. He takes it again with Plato's moving image of eternity, and
okay.
yes. But and if you bracket that, all I'm trying to, because the reason here is the problem is the historicality part, and there are two distinctions here. His temporality is not either the distinction between time and eternity, meaning linear time becoming change, impermanence versus permanence, nor is it just the infinite linear flow of time. So it's something else. And historicality and historizing, two things by the time you get to that section. It's definitely not history as it's occurring now, or what historians tell us is the past. Whoever uses it to politicize things or establish their power, we're against all that. And movement is not the motion of either thing. It's changing, metabole, or it's going. And for Paul, this timeliness, Zeitikung or Zeitlichkeit, is also not the Greek kairos, fulfillment time or propitious time. And it's not the parousia, which the later Heidegger will get into as well, which again could both mean arriving, coming, presence, but in the New Testament sense, parousia, of course, the second coming. So, you know, he's deconstructing the history of concepts of time itself. He's always been interested in that. The problem is that he can't get to the temporal grounding or the temporal horizon. He kind of speaks of them as both for this question of the movement of Dasein with others in what we would classically call the historical present or historical time. He never really, this project doesn't talk about it. And certainly as we move on in the later Heidegger, he talks about the history of being and how it's sent and how we have to reckon with these other major figures for this passage from the first beginning of the Greeks that leveled or forgot the difference between being and beings to this other beginning. And that's the later Heidegger period, which a lot of people debate. But for here, we don't get a sense that this temporality that he's talking about, or what you might want to say about that section in difference, the temporization, time becoming space, space becoming time, or does difference with the A compensate for the fact that difference with the E can only mean difference? What the heck is Derrida getting at? It has both possibilities, polysemous in its immediacy, irreducibly many, which is part of his project, right, for deconstruction. So, yeah, you want to be careful that you're not talking about the changeable versus the unchangeable. Quite frankly, that's weird thing about his finite temporality is it has nothing to do with the finite or infinite distinction. So then what the heck is it? And also, this is going to sound even scarier. You don't want to map ich bin gewesen, I am my beingness, with I am my, even though he says it here, but by the time I get to it, the past as in when I was 35, not 55, and presenting or making present, which then takes on both Anwesenheit and Gewesenheit, but the presencing of something is happening, phenomenon, logos, is not the present now. And the Ankunft, or the Zukünftigkeit, coming up to holding oneself accountable up to maybe as an ultimate judge, talk about the court, that frightening moment when your life is decided upon, is not the future as in tomorrow. So they don't map neatly, even if, and you may not even want to use the word time as Derrida says, Lucian Brandeis, to talk about what this other could be, because you'll never get around what we think time means. It has something to do with change in movement, but we can never pin it down from the Greeks onwards up to Hegel.
I suppose I'm thinking of this concept of historicality here
Yep.
against the epistemology of the ready to hand as distinguished from the present at hand, like the sense that the present at hand is theoretical knowledge and the ready to hand is practical knowledge. So you've got this. So you've got this distinction between theory and practice, where theory says that what is real is what is enduring, and practice says what is real is what I can touch, and so you've got this temporal, eternal distinction built into that epistemology, because it's like Heidegger is wanting to say that the history of ontology has prioritized the present at hand as the eternal essence, and he's bringing this essentially he's bringing this existential approach that's saying stuff for use is just as real as any theoretical description.
Those are both happening. I don't want to. I want to let's see if other folks want to take some different directions, but that's fine. But just if you want to forego the eternal substance of the present now, And then also you mentioned about action or praxis, and you would think it's poiesis as the event of an eternal that could happen like a one-time occurrence that once it's in place, as Kant says, it gives us the rule to judge art, so they become great works of art. But it's not something you can teach like science, the section on genius and the critique of judgment. But the point is that it's not the eternal now. And what you said about enduring or duration, you might think has that connotation of the eternal. But the Eweiligkeit is just the time, my time occurring or happening, which is going to be a finite stretch if you're mortal human beings like we are, beginning and ending, but it's the time in between and how that can occur or while happen as a stretch, but irreducible to either a now point. And I hate to tell you this, but the guy broke from his religion. So the resurrection of Jesus is not going to help to that type of eternity post mortal death. But he's also not talking about the faith leap of the finite into the eternal. I can't have the infinite conception of God from a finite conception unless it was put into me, as Descartes would say. Therefore, I got to believe in it. So he doesn't want that metaphysics either. And he doesn't want the linear time, which is just flowing, coming to be and passing away. You got it. We haven't gotten there yet. But once you get to that ecstatic, if you want to race in, Robbie, being section 65, we're done with care, Zorga, not anxiety, angst, not dissection of conscience and resolve, but just whatever care is. Well, it's a terrible way to translate the Zorga, but that's what we have. The being a Dasein towards its death, which is not dying physically or perishing, but the possibility of no longer, hey, what will have all this meant? But not what I'm going to be able to know right now as I'm living it. Because when I complete myself, I'm not going to be able to come back from the passage or transition to no longer and then tell you or me and myself and others, hey, this is what it's like. So I want that authentic relationship towards that last possibility. But I'm in the world. And as long as I'm in the world, I'm incomplete with all my other possibilities. I got to choose something. It's not going to be anything ontic. You see, he's going to go in these circles, but between being, Zorga, the care, structure of Dasein, the death as the greatest possibility to be, it's going to come back to this ecstatic temporality. And we get 10 pages where you're going to lose your mind because he leaves us with, there's an equiprimordial Gleichförmigkeit relationship between these three ecstasies. And each one is going to relate to the other two differently. You do the math, but if you go from past to present to future, future to present to past to future, you got 6 different possible directions among the 3. He's not a Hegel speculative guy that wants to conceptualize something like that into some very abstract notion. You could try to do that. Maybe analytics do that. Physicists can do their thing. That's not what this is about. It's more the stretch of life. It's strange movement linked up to this historizing, which is what he calls it later, and an ontological understanding of all this, which would then situate the Western tradition in how it's being received. He's not a fireman. He's not a policeman. He's not a doctor. He's a philosopher. So what he cares about is the reception of the tradition, but not for a purpose of defending it, hence the destruction, especially if it's going to justify the status quo, but to really open up what was being talked about way back when, Aristotle, Plato, to get in a more authentic sense of the question. He says this at the end of the introduction. Those guys posed the question. That's great. They made the start. He and Hegel both have to believe that. Derrida may question that Eurocentrism. Those great Greeks. But they didn't, they formed the question in a way where they could attempt to answer it. And maybe it was the supplication of their language, Paul, that allowed them to do that. That's the section in Being a Time. My powers conceptually are weaker, but the problem is being posed to me in a more complicated way than those guys can possibly imagine, i.e. passing through Christianity, which they didn't have to do. So, he doesn't say that, but he means the entire Western tradition up to his point. So I'm weaker. My language is going to be very difficult, and I'm not going to be able to answer this question, but I'm going to work on just trying to understand the complex posing, how we're going to pose this question, why we have to structure it this way. That's all I'm going to be able to do. And then, once I do that, maybe I can be in a position to do something, which he will. Anybody else want to come in? The difference part or this part? I know we're only, as you can see, we have to get to the very definition. I can show you the text. You'll see this section 6. And then, of course, at some point we have to end. I'm just tell you what's coming, if that's okay. This is how this section 6 started, but you don't really have a definition of the disruption until 4 pages later, taking the question of being as a clue. Starting from this question sounds deductive. It's definitely not historicist. We are to destroy the traditional content of ancient ontology, which extends from Aristotle to Kant, at least on the problem of time. Aristotle, for him, posed the question of time. Many scholars think that this is, if they want to prove he started with Aristotle when he was a kid, Brentano's book by his mentor and priest. And there's some other folks that come in between, especially the medieval period, but then he comes back full force. And then he's dealing with Plato too, and Kant, and Hegel, and Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. Husserl's his teacher, and then of course, but it's always Aristotle. And that's exactly what this chapter will say. Aristotle was the first to pose, because it takes us through Descartes. But, and of course, Kant. Where does he say that? Sorry. At some point, he says that Aristotle is the one that gives us this question of being in terms of time. Oh, Aristotle's essay on time is the first detailed interpretation of this phenomenon that's come down to us. That's what he's going to have to reckon with. 7 is the methodological interpretation of phenomenology, phenomenon and logos. And I'm going to take you to just the very end of this introductory chapter, which is here. Design of the treatise, section 8. All you get is part 1. This whole being in time is called part 1. There you go. There's your circle or non-circle. Dasein in terms of temporality, that's the meaning of its being. But time is a transcendent horizon for the question of being. Who's posing the question? Not Trump. Dasein is. Part 2, we don't have basic features of phenomenological construction, history and ontology, temporality as our clue. We'll talk about that in a second. All we have in this part 1 are these 2 divisions. That didn't appear in the missing division 3. And then this was supposed to come as part 2. What happens chronologically after being in time? A book on Kant, lecture series, phenomenological interpretations, Kant's critique of pure reason. Schematism is the hardest part in Kant, the reading representation between the sensible and the intelligible, the time determination. But to your point, Robbie, Heidegger will catch Kant. Time is that which does not change in order for change to take place within it. Eternal substance, permanence. He's going to go after that. But even in that lecture, the whole book, he's going off on the categories and all the achievements in Kant's critique. 2 pages at the end, he's trying to get to schematism. Doesn't get to it. Basic problems, 1927. He gives us the distinction between Zeitlichkeit, German for temporality, not Zeit, time, Zeitikum, Temporalität, the German translation of the English translation of Zeitlichkeit as temporality with a small t, but temporality with the big T in English is the Temporalität of the whole horizon for his project to get at this specific existential problem of temporality with a T, Zeitlichkeit. Back to Kant again, back to Aristotle. Doesn't get beyond what we have, honestly. It's kind of like a refreshing reproduction of ecstatic temporality being in time. Descartes, of course, is there. And then Aristotle in the beginning of Basic Problems, but not a separate work. And then back to Kant again. Leibniz in between. By 1929, this is all coming to a close. 30, you get Aristotle again, which is good, but not on time, physics. On energia and dunemos. Action, Activity, and Potential, Metaphysics, Book 9. And then guess who shows up in 1931? Right before he takes his sabbatical, he takes his break from it all and becomes the rector of Freiburg under the Nazis in 1933. Hegel's Phenomenology. And in that lecture, all he says at the very end, having spent the entire lecture on the introduction, not absolute knowing, which is the hardest part in Hegel's Phenomenology, there's a difference between us. I'm not trying to make light of Hegel or reduce him. Every thinker thinks thought in their own being in their own unique way. I'm not better than him. He's not better than me. We're just different, but let's face it. He really wanted to think time on the basis of, he wanted to think being on the basis of time. Time was supposed to be the concept, the metaphysical articulation of it in all of its complexity as this problem of historical time, but also the final conception of spirit as a reckoning with all the contradictions, with all those different previous shapes of the history of metaphysics to this ultimate notion, his system. So he's going to think being in terms of time. Looks like I was starting out with the question, time as a horizon, to pose the question of being. If and whether time has any kind of being, but being itself is open. It's not a closed entity in the world. So that's where I'm at. He's the metaphysician. I'm doing something different. 2 pages. There's no profound articulation. Is that accurate about Hegel? A lot of people would debate that. And where does that leave us with Heidegger being able to do all this? Where is this problem of temporality? So in other words, there is no, according to Heidegger for sure, and definitely Derrida, there's nothing in the West that can provide us any kind of resource, be it the history of metaphysics or the history of religion, let's assume Gentile Christianity, Catholic or Protestant, that will put us in a position to reckon with this question of time. Not only in an authentic way, but in a way that can challenge everything that's wrong with the way it has been posed and what it's led to. That's a very strong statement about the West. And you can believe it or not. You can say, well, no, I don't know what he means by that, or what are you talking about? The West has a problem with time. And the West is a problem of time. So I'm not happy with that direction, but just putting it out there. Okay. Any other perspectives or thoughts we want to maybe share? I'd say the guiding thread for the group is, this is what I work on, is that it's not being, and it's not being in the world, and it's not just a critique of origins in the history of philosophy and science. It's not trying to define deconstruction and method. The problem is always going to be about time. As an open signifier, I don't associate any content to that word.
I found the section that I was particularly interested in Simon Side 18.
Okay. Yep.
Time in this functions as a criterion for distinguishing realms of being, and how does time come to have this distinctive ontological function? It was always like just such a remarkable question that that had always fascinated me. How does time come? Because the way time has held this function is through the distinction between the eternal and the temporal, and so the question of how Heidegger understands those distinctions is really very interesting.
Is that paragraph 18 or section 18? Oh yeah, I have it here. I got it here. And this is interesting. The reason that you're pointing to this is that he will come back to Kant. Not only is it the a priori intuition, the aesthetic, without ever being something empirical or something we can know. It's a condition of possibility. But by the time he gets to the schematism, there's a bunch of ways in which time functions as that condition to order our representation so we can have any arrangement kind of being. It's coming back to very much Kant. But this, what you're also seeing here is, yeah, time is long, functions, ontological criteria for naively discriminating various realms of entities. See, a distinction has been made between temporal entities. He's deconstructing that. Natural processes, historical happenings, non-temporal, Derrida's geometric idealities, timeless meaning of propositions with the temporal course of assertions. He's deconstructing all these distinctions. He's not assuming any. Here, the temporal always means simply being in time, within timeness, which is pretty obscure. And he's getting that from Aristotle. So I'd take a step back, Robbie. He's never going to come back to your time is the condition of possibility, which is Kant. Does time have any being? Does it have a way to change a movement? Aristotle. Excuse me. And the whole kind of Platonic and maybe the Plotinus distinction of time and eternity. And quite frankly, this comes back to the New Testament, the kairos, the unity in time and eternity. So, or the pre-existent logos of John. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, there was existence with the Word, and then it became incarnate. So he's kind of like, you just got to assume. I know it's going on a leap of faith here that whatever you might think he's doing with regard to the time eternity distinction, he's not, because he's actually in fact questioning. How did these things come about? How did they come to take on such important relevance? See. The fact remains that time, in the sense of being in time, functions as a criteria for distinguishing between realms of being. Hitherto, no one has asked or troubled to investigate how time has come to have this distinctive ontological function, or with what right, nor has anyone, or with what right has anything like time functions as such criterion, nor has anyone asked whether the authentic ontological relevance, which was possible for it, gets expressed when time is used in so naively ontological a manner. He's critical. All these things, not just linear time flowing on clocks and calendars, is part of this inauthentic structure that needs to be destroyed. And it's not just how things are made present or have presence for us. It could be the
I
structure.
suppose I still feel that he's deconstructing a prioritization of the changeless over the changing. So he's saying Dasein exists within the realm of change, and the idea that truth is
unfortunately
unchanged.
Unfortunately that's not it.
Okay.
That's absolutely the beginning of the destruction. Because then you're just flipping the coin. He's just putting it back to the changeless, or Dasein is changing. That's not movement versus motion. It's not Dasein within time. You're gonna have to see that. You're gonna have to really dig into Division 2, unfortunately. You might want to just stay with this. Yeah, because you're just flipping the order of things. Instead, we know that the history of metaphysics prioritizes the eternal, the substance, or the predicate to the subject, or the eternal truth. He's not flipping it. He's going to say that's what Nietzsche's doing with becoming and change and the changing of values. So he's Derridean in a way. I mean, how can you say he's Derridean? Heidegger and Derrida both are going to question the binary opposition that you're operating under, or if you're flipping the hierarchy. It has nothing to do with change. That's Bergson, by the way, which you'll critique here being in time. You have this weird circle. Time needs to be explained primordially as a horizon, which he'll try to do with ecstatic temporality. And temporality is the meaning of Dasein, which understands being. So this being of Dasein is going to be rooted in that. And he'll try to take that from temporality to the schematic of the relationships between the three ecstasies to the problem of movement. I got being towards death, but I never gave us being towards birth. My project is incomplete. So now he's got the whole stretch. Then he takes that to this macro context of historicality as this massive event. It foreshadows what he means by the history of being in the event. It's passage to something different. So that's kind of like the trajectory. And it's not about, that's hard. I mean, I hate to tell you this, but that's not the metabolism of the changing structure, just changing. He'll say that, quite frankly, on the fate destiny. It's not about, hey, I'm being tossed around by the fates, like Odyssey. Everybody's talking about it right now. And someone's programming me, and I don't know what to do. And oh God, how did this happen in my life? All these convergences, I didn't expect this. Oh, I lost this, I won this, I got this. It's like, no, those are just the changing experiences. His whole project is not about human experience. That's the whole Weltanschauung and life worlds of his time. Everybody else was talking about it. He wasn't going for that. Oh, the decline of the West, Spengler. So it's not about, I hate to say it, it's not about experiencing time as change or changing yourself, but I'll bracket it there. You stick to it, you come back to it. We can look at a beautiful section in Schelling's lecture where he lays out the four different ways in the West of time opposed to eternity, their unity, putting one in the other, et cetera, et cetera. And he's like, well, I'm going to be questioning all this. He's going to try to get to something else. Okay. 1024. Any other last thoughts before we break for today? Unfortunately, we're going to keep moving now through 6 again. We'll try to spend more time on the origin of geometry, which is also chapter 6. We're not. We're only about halfway through that text. And if it's okay at this point, I just can't resist the temptation to try to like insert later text from Derrida if they give us some tools and definitions that we need so we can just we understand the words that we're using when we say things like deconstruction, for example. Worth reading Aristotle all the time. Oh, yes. In the Greek, Paul, or okay, well, Paul can bring in the Greek. I can try to. But what he's referring to
I
is
read it again
Aristotle's.
recently. I took a lot of notes on it. It's very interesting.
Yeah, just go with chapter 4, book 10. It's about 10 pages. You know, the whole Fez movement, he wants to talk about movement. Now, of course, he's about the unmoved mover, but he's talking about change. He can talk about, you know, the four causes. He's going to talk about, I mean, fusus is not just nature. Forget about that. Just this book 4, chapter 10, finally going to get to what he goes, okay, now I got to get to the question of time. What is it? Is it among the realm of things that are or not, that have being or don't have being? Hence Heidegger's breakthrough. But to Aristotle's point, even that Derrida will catch Heidegger on reducing Aristotle. Aristotle admits it's not just a sequence of nows, because it's going to have to be the limit of one thing and the beginning of something else. Or when something, how can something exist of things that don't exist? If it includes past and future, no longer, not yet. Everything is there. You're right, Paul. You absolutely, completely, totally. The good news, it doesn't read like Heidegger or Hegel. You should be able to read it while you're waiting at the airport or something, while your plane is being
It's
delayed or
interesting to
postponed.
compare with Augustine.
And then Augustine, for
Because
sure,
I was
Confessions.
writing about time in Greek.
Yeah,
With
you should do
Augustine,
Confessions,
time in Latin.
book
And
10
the
and
difference of
11.
language makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and he'll quote Augustine in section 81, Heidegger, when he says, I don't know what this is, but I think it might be an extension of the soul, the extendedness of the soul, stretched out, which is important for Heidegger. But all of Augustine's mysteries are in, sorry, did you get that? Book 10, book 10, and I believe 11 of the Confessions. So if you want to take a look at those two, yeah, book 10 and 11. Could be 11 and 12, 10, 11, but you'll see it's about time. Time is when we think it isn't, and it isn't when it is. Change becoming some of the issues you're talking about, Robbie. But yeah, if you can at least do Aristotle's book, chapter 4, book 10 on time, that's the only time it appears. But for the most part, the Greeks, like everybody else back then, were concerned about this strange thing called movement, the dunamis, and not the movement of locomotion, but being moved, Nicomachean Ethics, de anima, and of course the movement of life. And like, what the hell is this thing all about? It seems to move, but it's not the motion of something like a train. So yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Okay, folks, thank you so much. I actually have to end the session and we will, if it's okay, regroup in 2 weeks. We'll try to keep this more regular now. So we'll see each other in about 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.